Discover the power of one.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with Pastor Mark Cowart and all the tremendous speakers, and especially with you. I'm going to jump into my presentation. Did you know that there's a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, Arthur Schlesinger? He was on John F. Kennedy's staff. He said, "History is to the nation as memory is to the individual." Have you ever met an individual who has lost their memory? Maybe they have Alzheimer's. They forgot who they are. They forgot who you are. They can be taken advantage of very easily. Guess what? We have national Alzheimer's. Here we are, the freest and most prosperous country that the planet has ever seen, and we forgot how we got here, and as a result, it's slipping through our fingers like sand. We need to get our memory back and realize how totally unique our country is. Do you know there's approximately 6,000 years of recorded human history? Writing was invented around 3,000 or 4,000 BC, Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets, and then around 3,000 BC is when Egyptian hieroglyphics were invented, and around 2,600 BC, Chinese pictogram characters. So you round it out, it's 3,000 or 4,000 BC, we're around 2080, that's 5,000 or 6,000 years of records of human beings writing down human records. Coincidentally, that's about as long as the Bible says a man's been around. So we look at Franklin Roosevelt said in 1940, he says, 5,000 years of recorded history have proven that mankind has always believed in God in spite of the many abortive attempts to exile God. Richard Overy wrote, "The Times Complete History of the World. No date appears before the start of human civilizations around 5,500 years ago and the beginning of a written history." Daniel Webster wrote, "Miracles do not cluster, and what has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there will be anarchy throughout the world." He thought something special happened here. Justice James Wilson signed the Declaration and the Constitution and was put on the Supreme Court by George Washington. He said, "After a period of 6,000 years since creation, the United States exhibit to the world the first instance of a nation assembling voluntarily and deciding that system of government under which they should live." So 6,000 years is not that long. It's only 60 people living 100 years each back to back. How many of you have met someone who's lived 100 years? Maybe a grandmother? We're talking 60 grandmothers, and you're all the way back to the beginning of recorded human history. 60 people living 100 years each. But it's been a 6,000-year quest to rule the world. So what do these records show? They show that power wants to concentrate into the hands of one person, beginning with Nimrod and the Tower of Babel, him concentrating power, and God coming down and confusing the languages, and they scatter. And so we see there's 2,000 years and 33 major Egyptian dynasties ruled by pharaohs. 5,000 years, 18 major Chinese dynasties ruled by emperors. Indian Maharajas, Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus of Persia, Darius, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan. The centuries go on, but one thing keeps repeating. Every generation tries to rebuild the Tower of Babel with a Nimrod. And this person is a dictator. And so the most common form of government is a king. And it happens, it's just like a pull of gravity, like a law of magnet. And there's a line in the movie Lord of the Rings where Gandalf tells Frodo, "Always remember, Frodo, the ring is trying to get back to its master. It wants to be found." Power wants to concentrate. I think it goes back to the fall in the garden and selfishness coming into the human DNA and Cain killing Abel. And so you put some babies in a playpen, one of them takes the rattle from the others. Put some kids on a playground, one of them is the bully hogging the ball. Put some girls in a junior high clique, and one of them is the diva. You put some natives in the woods, one of them is the Indian chief. You put some people in an inner city, one of them is the gang leader. And all a king is, in a sense, is a glorified gang leader. And it's a hierarchical system where if you are friends with the king, you are more equal. If you are not friends with the king, you are less equal. And if you're an enemy of the king, you're a slave or you're dead. It's called treason. And so for most of world history, equality was how close of an orbit can you get to the king. And so it's like a pyramid, right? Where the pharaoh on top and his scribes and administrators and then the slaves on the bottom. And they actually got a little theology to back it up. They call it the divine right of kings. God chose me to be the king, so whatever my will is, it must be God's will. And so the king was like this divinely appointed political intermediary. And here's Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, because his subjects were planets that revolved around him. He said, "I am the state." And then he says, "It is legal because I wish it." Lo and behold, the law is just simply the king's will forced down the pyramid on everybody. And so it took centuries before America was given the chance to break away from the king and flip it and make the people the king. And so as these centuries go on, the kingdoms get bigger and bigger and bigger. Every generation tries to get bigger. And so finally in the 1500s, the two most powerful kings on the planet was the Muslim Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent of the Ottoman Empire and Charles V of Spain of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, a little background on Muslims. Muhammad started his faith in 610 AD. He is a religious leader in the pagan city of Mecca. He only makes 70 converts. He gets frustrated and confrontational, and the people chase Muhammad out of town in 622 AD for disturbing the peace. And so he has nowhere to go. He's a Muslim refugee. He goes north 210 miles to a Jewish city. They're nice. They let Muhammad in as a Muslim immigrant. Muhammad goes into the minority neighborhoods in Medina and finds people that have grievances against the Jewish government, and he begins to organize them. We're familiar with the term of organizing in the community. He gets a following. He goes to the Jews, and he pressures them to accommodate him and his followers politically. And the Jews do. Now Muhammad's a political leader in addition to being a religious leader. Then Muhammad's followers in Mecca get pushy and argumentative and threatening. They get chased out of town for disturbing the peace. They have nowhere to go. They're Muslim refugees. They go to Medina, and the Jews let him in as Muslim immigrants, and Muhammad allows his followers to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing them out of town. So where Jesus said, if they take your coat, give them your shirt, Muhammad's attitude was, if they take your house, you retaliate, take their caravan. And so he got a whole chapter of the Quran from his Allah on how to distribute booty from robbing caravans. It's Surah 8, chapter 8. He gets a fifth of the booty. Anyway, the Meccans send 1,000 soldiers to protect their caravan, and Muhammad with 300 warriors defeats 1,000 at the Battle of Badra. And so he transitions to a military leader. And so we see within the next 23 years of his death, the Muslims conquer Yemen, which used to be a Jewish kingdom, conquer Jerusalem, which had been a Byzantine Christian city since Constantine. Muslims conquered Syria, which was the first country to completely be Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. The name Christian was first used in Syria until Caliph Umar conquered it. Muslims conquered Egypt, which was completely Christian, evangelized by Mark, that wrote the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa, all wiped out by the Umayyad Muslims. This happened so fast, it was a heart attack to the Roman economy. And then the Muslims cross the Strait of Gibraltar and invade Spain. And they conquer it in 10 years. Because Spaniards are fighting on foot, Muslims are on Arabian horses with stirrups and scimitar swords. They cross the Pyrenees Mountains, and they're stopped outside of Paris in 732 AD, exactly 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. They go from Arabia to Paris in a 100-year military campaign. And then they come around the other side of the Mediterranean. The Turks convert to Islam, and they invade into what is today Turkey. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were wiped out by the Muslim Ottoman Turks. And these cities in the New Testament, Ephesus, Philippi, Galatia, Corinth, all these New Testament letters to those cities were wiped out by the Muslim Turks. Anyway, by the 1500s, the Muslim Sultan controls this enormous area of Morocco, Algiers, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, the Middle East, into Eastern Europe. Well, his counterpart, as I mentioned, is the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V of Spain. And he controls all of Spain, Spanish Netherlands, Italy, and Portugal. And then the New World, he takes the gold from the New World to fight the Muslims from taking over the Mediterranean. And the Philippines are named after his son, King Philip of Spain. And so these are the 2 kings. Now, Martin Luther starts the Reformation in 1517. But in 1529, 100,000 Muslims surround Vienna, Austria. Martin Luther says, the Turk is the rod of the wrath of the Lord our God. If the Turk's God, the devil, is not beaten first, there's reason to fear the Turk will not be so easy to beat. John Calvin wrote, I hear the sad condition of your Germany. The Turk again prepares to wage war with a larger force. Who will stand up to oppose his marching throughout the land at his mere will and pleasure? John Wesley wrote, ever since the religion of Islam appeared in the world, espousers of it have been as wolves and tigers to all other nations, rending and tearing all that fell into their merciless paws. 2 centuries before the Reformation, Thomas Aquinas wrote, Muhammad seduced the people by promises of carnal pleasure. Those who believed in him were brutal men and desert wanderers. Muhammad forced others to become his followers by the violence of his arms. So, Catholic Holy Roman Emperor Charles V of Spain is faced with a double dilemma. Protestant Reformation on one hand, Muslim invasion on the other hand. And so he does something. He calls it the Peace of Augsburg of 1555. he makes a treaty with the Protestants. This is the first treaty ever to recognize Protestants. And in this treaty is a little Latin phrase that had enormous repercussions across Europe. What was the phrase? Cuius regio eius religio, which means whose is the reign, his is the religion. In other words, look, Protestant king, believe whatever you want in your kingdom. Let's just work together against these Muslims who are invading Europe because they want to kill us all. And so it worked. So prior to the Muslim invasion, all of Western Europe was Roman Catholic. After the Muslim invasion, Western Europe began to switch where different kings believed different things. So northern Germany and Sweden were Lutheran, Switzerland, Calvinist, Scotland, Presbyterian, Holland, Dutch Reformed, Greece was Greek Orthodox, Russia was Russian Orthodox, England was Anglican, and of course Spain, Portugal, France, Austria, Italy, and Poland remained Catholic. But it was one Christian denomination per country in Europe. What the king believed, the kingdom had to believe. And if you did not believe the way your king did, you were persecuted and you fled. So suddenly, in the century after this Muslim invasion, there's this mass migration of people shifting all around Europe simply for conscience sake. And those were the ones that spilled over and founded colonies in America. Now let's look at England. England had a king named Henry VIII. He's Catholic. He's married to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the King of Spain, the most powerful guy in the world, right? And after 18 years, Catherine does not have a son. A daughter married, but not a son, so Henry decides to divorce her. The Pope will not recognize the divorce because she is, after all, the daughter of the most powerful guy in the world. And so Henry decides he's going to make himself his own Pope. So Henry VIII starts the Church of England, puts himself on as the head, and he goes on to have 6 wives. And their fates were divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So Henry VIII was not a really nice guy to be married to. Well, his advisors suggested to him, if he really wanted to go through breaking with Rome, he should stop using that old Latin Bible and get himself an English Bible. And so he does, he spreads the English Bible around, but something unexpected happened. People began to read it and began to compare what's in this Bible to this king divorcing and beheading his wives and claiming to be the head of the church. And so a group started that wanted to purify the Church of England, and they were nicknamed the Puritans. Well, the king did not think he needed any purifying, so he persecuted them. He would send spies into their churches to listen to the sermons, and if they didn't fit in with the Anglican liturgy, the pastor was arrested. Sort of sounds like Houston with the lesbian mayor wanting to censor all the sermons of the pastors. Well, there was another group that said, it's beyond hope of trying to purify the Church of England. We are going to separate ourselves. They were called separatists. We call them pilgrims. And so they were persecuted and they fled. They fled to Holland for 12 years, and then when Spain threatened to attack Holland, they fled again to America. Now, I read through every charter of every colony and found some interesting things. There were 3 types of colonies. There were company colonies, royal crown colonies, and proprietary colonies. A company colony is the Virginia Company. It has bylaws, and the king would approve the bylaws, and it had investors of blacksmiths and cooks and people wanting to get a return out of it. But the king ruled the colony by approving the bylaws. Well, Virginia Company went bankrupt. They threw it in the king's lap, and they said, this is your problem. And so he sent over a royal crown governor who ruled it directly under the king. A third type of colony is called a proprietary colony, where the whole thing is given as property to a particular individual. So all of Maryland was given to Lord Baltimore. All of Pennsylvania was given to William Penn. And the Carolinas were given to the 7 Lord proprietors, the property owners. Well, when the Pilgrims got blown off course and landed in Massachusetts, there was no government to submit to. It was just a beach. And so the people on the Mayflower says, well, who's going to be in charge? There's no king-appointed person on our boat. We can't just get off and be lawless. And so they decide they're going to write their own government. It's called the Mayflower Compact, the first constitution written in the New World. And there's a little line in there that was revolutionary. It was, in ye presence of God, we covenant ourselves together into a civil body politic. They create a political body. To enact just and equal laws as shall be thought most meet, unto which we promise all due submission. Simple, revolutionary. This was them granting themselves permission to form a government. It wasn't the king having somebody on the boat that tells them what to do. This was them telling themselves what to do under God. Now, where in the world did these pilgrims get the idea that they could create their own government? Well, their pastor, John Robinson, there kneeling on the deck with his hands up, and then William Brewster with an open Bible, they got the idea from the Bible. Matter of fact, this painting is in our U.S. Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. John Robinson, their pastor, was not a king-appointed Anglican pastor. He was a separatist pastor. And he told his little congregation, when you got really tough decisions, you all get together and fast and pray and vote. And so this was a bottom-up form of government rather than a king-appointed top-down government. Now, as I mentioned, I read through all the charters, and I found very interesting things, that every colony was started by a different Christian denomination. Virginia was Anglican. Massachusetts was Puritan. New York was Dutch Reformed. Maryland was originally Catholic. New Jersey was Swedish Lutheran. Gustav Adolphus of Sweden wanted to found New Sweden. Delaware was New Sweden, Swedish Lutheran. Rhode Island was founded by Baptists. Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers. Georgia was a plain Protestant colony. Connecticut was founded by Congregationalist Christians, as was New Hampshire. And North Carolina was officially Anglican, but the Lord proprietors left a little loophole in their charter to let in non-Anglicans because they wanted to hurry up and populate the colony so they could get a financial return on the colony. And so into the Carolinas flood Presbyterians and Quakers and Puritans, and then they get a new governor that wants to tighten the screws and make it more Anglican. And that's when South Carolina breaks away in 1711 saying, we don't want to get more Anglican. And so the different colonies were founded by different denominations. I read through all of the colonial legislative acts, and I found some interesting ones. Here's one. In Virginia in 1624, it says, whosoever shall absent himself from divine service any Sunday without an allowable excuse shall forfeit a pound of tobacco. You not only went to church, you had to go to church. And then I read through every state constitution. I found something interesting. 9 of the original 13 state constitutions required you to be a Protestant Christian to hold state office. So here's South Carolina, 1778 state constitution. The Christian Protestant religion shall be deemed the established religion of this state. I've actually talked to attorneys that said, well, if they wanted America to be a Christian country, why didn't they just say so in the Constitution? I go, duh, they did. They're state constitutions. Did you read them? Christian Protestant religion shall be deemed the established religion of the state. Here's Massachusetts Constitution written by John Adams. Any person before he executes the duties of his office shall subscribe, I declare that I believe the Christian religion and have a firm persuasion of its truth, and the legislature shall authorize, support, and maintenance of public Protestant teachers of piety, religion, and morality. And I mentioned Georgia, 1777, says representatives shall be chosen out of the residents of each county, and they shall be of the Protestant religion. New Jersey's 1776 Constitution, all persons professing a belief in the faith of any Protestant sect who shall demean themselves peacefully under the government shall be capable of being elected. New Hampshire's 1784 Constitution, no person shall be capable of being elected who is not of the Protestant religion. That was in effect up until 1877. So 9 states, you had to be a Protestant. 3 states were liberal. They said all you had to do was be a Christian, right? And so one of those is Delaware. His original constitution, every person appointed to office shall subscribe, I profess faith in God the Father and Jesus Christ, his only Son, the Holy Ghost, one God, blessed forevermore. That was really liberal. Because you not only could be a Protestant, you could be any denomination of Protestant, you could even be Catholic and say that, right? So 3 states allowed Catholics in. Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York. Now, they didn't even have full rights in those. And there was only 7 synagogues in the whole country, only 1,500 Jews. So 3 million people at the time of the Revolution, 30,000 Catholics, 1%, and 0.1% Jewish. And another liberal state was Pennsylvania. Ben Franklin signed its constitution, says each member shall subscribe, I do believe in one God, the creator and governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good, the punisher of the wicked, and I acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. In other words, you not only had to lay your hand on a Bible to swear into office in Pennsylvania, you had to swear you believed in the Bible in order to hold office, which makes sense. What good would it do you to lay your hand on a book you didn't believe in? You know, maybe swearing on a cookbook, open it up to lasagna or something. So the idea is that you're calling a higher power to hold you accountable. Well, then there's an Irish potato famine in the early 1800s. Millions of Irish Catholics come to America. The Catholic percent goes from 1% to 20%. And there's a large anti-Catholic, anti-Irish immigrant backlash, and then it settles down, and then states begin to accommodate them. You see, each state expanded religious freedom at their own speed, like a racetrack with 13 lanes. And so, like today, some states have smoking bans and others do not. Some states have marijuana and others do not. Some states have prostitution like Nevada, and thank God the rest don't. Back then, some states gave a little more religious freedom, and some states had blue laws where everything's closed on a Sunday. But it was up to the people in the states to decide. And so, let's look at North Carolina's original 1776 state constitution. No person who shall deny the being of God or the truth of the Protestant religion or the divine authority of the Old or New Testament shall be capable of holding office. Now, in 1835, after the Irish potato famine, they changed it. See if you can see what changed. It went from Protestant to Christian, right? So this is 1835. We're well into our country's history. No person who shall deny the being of God or the truth of the Christian religion. This meant that Catholics could also hold office. Then there's a persecution of Jews in Bavaria, and 250,000 Jews fled to America, and many states began to accommodate them, like Maryland. So Maryland's original 1776 Constitution says no other test is required than an oath to the state and a declaration of belief in the Christian religion. Let's see if you can see what changed. In 1851, they added, and if the party shall profess to be a Jew, the declaration shall be of a belief in a future state of rewards and punishments. So as of 1851, you could hold office in Maryland if you were a Christian or a Jew. And then here's an interesting one. Colorado says, we the people of Colorado with profound reverence for the supreme ruler of the universe. So number one, it acknowledges that God exists. And number two, it acknowledges that he's singular. So we're not talking Buddhism or Hinduism. And then I found this. It says, Colorado, no person shall be denied any civil right or political right on account of his opinions concerning religion. So what does that mean? That means that if your opinions concerning religion is that your religion defines marriage as one man and one woman, you cannot be denied any civil right. Now here's also in Colorado, 1876, but the liberty of conscience hereby secured shall not be construed to dispense with or excuse acts of licentiousness. Now what's licentiousness? That's sexual immorality. So in other words, you can't say, hey, we got freedom to do sexual immoral stuff. No. You have freedom of conscience, but you can't use it to do sexually immoral things. Wow, that's quite a change from what we have today. And anyway, so also, the motto for Colorado is nil sine numine, nothing without the deity. Now let's focus on New England. New England was founded by pastors and their colonies. Out of the whole world, you've got kings and pharaohs and Caesars and Kaisers. In America, you got these colonies started by different religious denominations, but many of them, they have their state denominations, their colonies. But here, let's look at New England. You have pastors and churches founding communities. So it's a Reverend John Cotton and his church founded Boston. A Reverend John Lothrop and his church founded Barnstable, Massachusetts. A Reverend Roger Williams and his church founded Providence, Rhode Island. Reverend John Wheelwright and his church founded Exeter, New Hampshire. And a Reverend Thomas Hooker and his church founded Hartford, Connecticut. So what happened? The Puritans were persecuted in England, but they came to America in a great migration, 30,000 of them. And once they got here, there were so many of them, they thought, well, maybe it's not such a bad thing that the government tell the church how to have church. And that's when Thomas Hooker said to his church, hey, you know what? We don't really like it anymore here in Puritan, Massachusetts. Everybody, next Saturday, get your wagons and your oxen. We're going to start going hill and dale, find a nice spot, make peace with the Indians. And they did. And they chopped down some trees, built their buildings, and then they went to the pastor. And they said, Pastor, how do we do the government thing? And so he gives a sermon in 1638 on how to do the government thing. And he says, in there, the foundations of authority is laid firstly in the free consent of the people. Now, that's revolutionary because the whole world's ruled by kings and pharaohs, and they claim, no, the foundation of authority is that the God gave me the right to be the king, and I dispense it. No, he said, no, it's from the bottom up. It's the free consent of the people. Thomas Hooker's sermon was turned into the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. The pastor's sermon became the colonial charter, their constitution. And then it became a blueprint for the other New England colonies and eventually the U.S. Constitution. Connecticut got called the Constitution State, and Thomas Hooker's statue is at the Hartford Capitol in Connecticut. And so there he is with his Bible. So how can you have a separation of church and state in Connecticut when it's the pastor, his sermon, and the church that created the state? And they used his sermon all the way from 1638 to when? 1818. So many states rewrote their constitution when they broke from England. Not Connecticut. They said, our constitution's working just fine. We used it 1638 to 1880. The pastor's sermon. So in New England, instead of separation of church and state, it was the church and pastors that created the state. Calvin Coolidge writes, the principles which went into the Declaration of Independence are found in the sermons of the early colonial clergy. They preached equality because they believed in the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man. In order that they might have freedom to express these thoughts and opportunities to put them into action, whole congregations with their pastors migrated to the colonies. Now, these pastors held two different views. One was a Puritan view that says God has a plan for your life, your marriage, your family. Another's a pietist view. Pietism. Well, you know, Martin Luther started the Reformation. He had the personal revelation, the just shall live by faith, but some princes wanted to break away from Rome. And so they said, kingdom of mine, you are all now Lutheran. If you don't like it, leave. And so the people said, okay, we're Lutheran. What do we believe again? So for the people in those kingdoms, it was not the same personal experience that Martin Luther had. And so a movement started called pietism that says, look, believing in Jesus is more than just doctrine. You have to have a personal experience with Jesus, and when you do, your life should change. And you'll no longer do worldly things like go to bars and brothels and theaters and get involved in government. Wait, what was that last thing? Yeah, worldly people are involved in government, and if you really are a Christian, you're not going to be around those worldly people. It was the beginning of our separation of church and state concept, right? Oh, it's dirty. Don't get involved in politics. So you got the one view that says, hey, God's got a plan, and the other says no. Well, I'm going to skip past some stuff for the sake of time and talk about the brothers. So in New England, they had this idea that the kingdom of God could never be forced from the top down. They fled from Europe where kings were burning people at the stake if they didn't believe the way the king did. And they looked in the scriptures and they saw that Jesus never forced anybody to follow him. Jesus said something difficult. Many disciples walked with him no more. And so, it's not like Islamic Sharia law, where if you leave, you get your head chopped off. Jesus turned to Peter and says, you want to go too? You're free to leave. And so the founders of these New England colonies says, if the kingdom of God cannot be forced from the top down, how is it going to happen? They thought if the majority of the people held godly values and voted for representatives to represent them, and they had these godly values, then laws would be passed reflecting these godly values, and they could come from the bottom up, not forced from the top down. Can you see the picture? So instead of it being the creator giving the rights to the king and he shoves it down on everybody else, no, our declaration says the creator gives the rights directly to the people. We sort of conveniently leave out the king. Did you notice on the equation there? And then the people choose their leaders. This was the miracle. Now, where did the Pilgrims get this idea? Well, they did get some ideas, the founders of the New England colonies. They did get some ideas from the Magna Carta in England, where 25 barons surrounded King John on the fields of Runnymede and forced him to sign the Magna Carta, limiting the arbitrary power of a king. They did get some ideas from the Roman Republic until Julius Caesar found a way to usurp power and make himself dictator for life. They did get some ideas from the Athenian democracy, where everybody got together every day in the market to talk politics until Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, figured out that he could bribe citizens of Athens with money under the table and they would betray their own city. And so Philip conquered them. But the founders of America ultimately got the idea from ancient Israel. You think, really? The U.S. Constitution was written and then it needed to go to the states to be ratified. They needed 9 states. They had 8. New Hampshire was in line to be the 9th, but it was in a deadlock. And so Harvard President Samuel Langdon gives an address. The Republic of the Israelites, an example to the American states. After this address, they vote, they're the 9th state, and the U.S. Constitution goes into effect after this sermon. What was the Republic of the Israelites? David Barton referred to it. It was that first 400 years when Israel comes out of Egypt. Remember that? They left Egypt where the Pharaoh controlled everything. They go into the promised land, and those first 400 years, no king. Everyone is equal before the law. And the law says there is no respect of persons in judgment. Rich or poor, everyone is to be treated the same. Male and female, made in the image of the Creator. Lo and behold, ancient Israel is the beginning of the concept of equality on planet Earth. That everyone you see is equal to you. There's no royal family to butter up next to. Ancient Israel is the first nation with private land ownership. All those boring chapters in the Bible where they did surveys and lots and divided up the land. You see, wherever there's a king, you never really own the land. It is always conditional of you staying on the nice side of the king. You cross the king, he will take away the land and kill you. In ancient Israel, the land was permanently titled to the families. If they got in a pinch and sold it, every 50 years it reverted back to the family. This prevented a dictator from gathering up the land and putting the people back into slavery. And if you can own land, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible called that being blessed. Karl Marx called it being a capitalist. Right? You got capital, you got stuff, you worked hard and saved it. That's why they call it the promised land, because the people got to own the land. Ancient Israel had no police, because everyone was taught the law, everyone enforced the law. Everybody was deputized. Ancient Israel had no standing army. You have a king, he has an army to enforce his will. In ancient Israel, every man was in the militia and armed and ready at a moment's notice to defend his family and his community. Ancient Israel had no prisons. Remember Joseph wasting away in prison in Egypt? In Israel, the law says that when somebody commits a crime, you bring them to the gates of the city, you get the elders there, and you have the trial immediately. And then there's a city of refuge you could run away to await a trial. But swift justice. Ancient Israel had a bureaucracy-free welfare system. So it wasn't like Egypt where you sold your soul to the Pharaoh to get a handout of grain. In Israel, when somebody harvested their field, they left the gleanings for the poor people to pick through. This way, the poor were taken care of without some political leader collecting everything and doling it back out to those who could help them stay in power. Ancient Israel had a system of honesty where God hates unjust weights and measures. This became a basis for commerce, and ancient Israel got to choose their own leaders. What do I mean? Well, Moses spake unto the children of Israel, how can I myself alone bear your burden? Take you wise men and understanding and known among your tribes, and I'll make them rulers over you. This was an election process, right? And so instead of Moses saying, you're the leader, he said, no, take you wise, known among your tribes. So anybody could be raised up in leadership in Israel. And so Gideon, here's Deborah, becomes a leader in Israel simply because she knows the law and she's honest, and people make their way all the way across the country. She sits under a tree, here's their cases. Where else in the world could a woman become a leader who's not related to a pharaoh or a king? And ancient Israel is the first nation where everyone could read. Remember those cuneiform characters I told you about? They had 1,500 cuneiform characters, and it was only for kings and their scribes. The common people didn't read, they were not allowed to read. So the first invention was the plow. Cain was the tiller of the soil. Then people started hitting each other with the plows and turned into weapons. Then they gravitated together into cities for protection. And when you get people together, somebody ends up being the one telling everybody else what to do. And at first it's good because you save yourself, your lives. But then this person has kids and grandkids who claim to be an elite class. And then it turns into this hereditary monarchy. Well, my dad and granddad started this whole thing, and I'm more special than the rest of you. And it turns back into, and so the kings claimed to own everything. And they needed accountants to keep track. And so in Sumeria, they came up with a way of counting of tokens and dishes. Little tokens, and they made markings in the tokens, and then that turned into cuneiform. Well, they had 1,500 cuneiform characters, but only the kings and the scribes could read them. And then in Egypt, they had 3,000 hieroglyphic characters. Again, only for the pharaohs and the scribes. Matter of fact, the scribes kept the hieroglyphs complicated on purpose as job security. It was their secret knowledge. They were needed to interpret these complicated hieroglyphs. And the common people didn't read. They were not allowed to read. In China, had 10,000 characters, and again, only for court records. Anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss says, ancient writing's main function was to facilitate the enslavement of other human beings. Here's George Orwell wrote in 1984, in the long run, a hierarchical society was only possible on the basis of poverty and ignorance. And remember Frederick Douglass, the Republican advisor to Lincoln, the African-American leader? He writes about growing up on some plantation, and the slave master's sister-in-law was teaching him the alphabet. The slave master walks in and yells at her, don't you dare teach slaves to read, they'll grow discontent and want to run away. So in other words, if you want to control people, you want them to be ignorant. Maybe go through some Common Core type thing where they go through the motions, but you don't want them coming out thinking critically. Now, when Moses came down the mountain, he did not just have the law, he had the law in a 22-character alphabet. Not 1,500 characters or 3,000 or 10,000, 22 characters. It was so easy to learn, the entire nation became literate. Even the little kids could learn how to read. Ancient Israel is the first instance in world history where everyone could read. And not only could they read, they were required to read because the law was addressed to each person. And Truman said the fundamental basis of this nation's laws was given to Moses on the Mount. I'm going to skip past it for the sake of time. So it's a spectrum of power. One side's total government, the other side's no government. Everybody hold up a fist in one hand and say concentrated power, concentrated power. Fingers apart with the other hand, say separated power, separated power. Then back to the fist, concentrated power, concentrated. That's world history. For most of world history, power is in the hands of the kings, pharaohs, Caesar, Kaiser, sultans, and czars. Every now and then, beginning with Israel, very rarely would people get an opportunity to rule themselves without a king. And it worked temporarily until the rubber band snapped back in times of crises. And so you have the king on one side, and so power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, Lord Acton. And so for the people to rule without a king, the people need virtue. They need an internal moral. They need laws. But wait a second. Why would you follow an internal moral? What would cause you to deny yielding to a selfish temptation? Ancient Israel introduced into the world the necessary ingredient. A God who is watching everyone. He wants you to be fair. He will hold you accountable in the future. So you're about to steal something. You know you can get away with it. Nobody's around. But then you think, wait a second, God is watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates something in your head called a conscience. If everybody in the country believes God is watching, he wants me to be fair, he's going to hold me accountable in the future, everybody is motivated to follow these internal morals and laws, and you can have complete order in society with no policeman following everybody around. Maximum liberty. Now, it only works with the God of the Bible. An Islamic Allah God says there's an infidel woman there, you can rape her, you can steal from this infidel, lie to this infidel. Only the God of the Bible says do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Here is Democrat candidate for president William Jennings Bryan stated, a religion which teaches personal responsibility to God gives strength to morality. There is a There is a powerful restraining influence in the belief that an all-seeing eye scrutinizes every thought and act of the individual. Ben Franklin says, the soul of man is immortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting his conduct in this. Anyway, here's a great quote from John Adams. He says, let it once be revealed or demonstrated that there is no future state. And my advice to every man, woman, and child would be to take opium. He goes on to say, for there is nothing in this world worth living for but hope, and every hope will fail us if that last hope, that of a future state, is extinguished. Here's William Lynn, first chaplain of the U.S. House. Let my neighbor persuade himself that there is no God, and he will pick my pocket and break not only my leg but my neck. If there be no God, there is no future account. Here's Ronald Reagan. Without God, there is no virtue because there's no prompting of the conscience. So you get rid of this God, all you got is rules. Why follow them? Some will, some won't. And those that won't are going to start robbing and stealing and smashing windows and setting buildings on fire and having mobs in the street. And then it's going to turn into this chaos, and everybody's going to say, government, please step in to stop this random violence and killing. And the government will come in and go house to house and collect everybody's guns. And yeah, they'll restore order. But when the dust settles, you'll have fundamentally transformed your country from the people ruling themselves back to a king. So what happened with Israel? It worked as long as the priest taught it. You see, everybody's born with a selfish nature. It's like every computer you buy is preloaded with a virus, and you have to immediately take it to the geek squad, right, to get it cleaned off. Well, every kid is born preloaded with the virus of selfishness, and they would take him to the Levi, the rabbi, the priest, and say, recode this kid. And he'd say, okay, kid, you want to steal, don't steal. You want to lie, don't lie. You want to commit adultery, don't commit adultery. What Israel was attempting to do was counter human nature, and it worked as long as the priests taught it. When the priests stopped teaching the law, the thing fell apart. So here's Eli, the high priest, his own sons are sleeping with women in the tent of meeting. He's supposed to be teaching the law to the nation, and his own sons aren't following the law. And then there's the story of a Levite with the tribe of Dan, and he's got a graven image. And the tribe of Dan comes along and goes to this house of Micah. They take the graven image, they take this Levite, and they say, you can be a priest for our whole tribe. And you're reading the story and you're scratching your head thinking, what's this Levite doing with a graven image? Isn't that one of the laws? You're not supposed to be having graven images? Shows the priests weren't living the law, much less teaching it. And then, as David mentioned, there's the story of a Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite's to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is with a woman he's not even married to. Shows he's not living the law, much less teaching it. They're traveling. They're at a house surrounded by sodomites. Something about that behavior that appears at the very last stages of a nation ruling itself without a king, right? They're yielding to this uninhibited inhibitions. And so they bang on the doors. He shoves the poor girl out. She gets raped, dies. He comes out, chops her body in 12 pieces, sends it to the 12 tribes. They all get together and kill the sodomite. And by the time you're grossed out, you read this line that says, Every man did what was right in their own eyes. Why did they all do what was right in their own eyes? Because the priests had stopped teaching them what was right in the Lord's eyes. So the whole thing fell apart. And so they all go to Samuel the prophet, and they said, we want to be like all the other countries. This isn't working. And the Lord tells Samuel, they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. Lo and behold, God's perfect plan for Israel was to not have a king, have everybody be equal under the law, and then priests teaching them the system, own private property, be blessed. Well, what happened? Saul changed things up. And so he's pouting. My son made a league with David and nobody cares about me. Doeg says, I care. I saw David go to the city of Nob. He got the bread and the sword of Goliath. Saul says, bring those priests here. Turns to his men, says, kill them. The men hesitate. Doeg says, I'll kill him. He goes out and kills them all. What just happened there? Israel had been a republic where the people rule individually accountable to God. The priests are the ones that teaches them the law and how to be accountable. And the law says that you don't kill somebody without 2 or 3 witnesses. All you got is one witness, Doeg. And the law says you get the elders of the city together and they hear the case, right? And there were no elders. It was just Saul saying it. And so they were accountable to God. Well, Doeg says, King, I'm going to surrender my conscience to you. I'm going to surrender my conscience to the state. If you tell me to do something, I will do it. It reminds me of these early Baptists there in England, and the king was demanding people believe the way he said. And one of the Baptist writers said, if the king can stand there on the day of judgment and answer for your conscience, fine. Believe whatever the king tells you. But if the king's not going to be there on the day of judgment, you are accountable to God for your own conscience. And so I was reading about a Chinese emperor who wanted to see who was loyal to him. He pulls in a deer and goes to his generals and says, this is a horse. And the general says, that's not a horse, that's a deer. He kills the general. Next general, this is a horse. That's not a horse, that's a deer. He kills the general. Next general, this is a horse. Okay, yeah, the deer's a horse. You see, a king demands your soul, your conscience, your reasoning, everything. So the king says, okay, there's no more male and female. And somebody says, no, there's male. Oh, go get rid of this one. Punish him. Next guy. Oh, there's male. No, there's no more male and female. Okay, there's no more male and female, right? The government, the king wants your soul. He wants your life. He wants everything about you. He wants to be your master instead of God. So Yale President Ezra Stiles says, the secular welfare of God's ancient people depended upon their virtue, their observance of that holy covenant which Israel entered into with God. And anyway, so America, by the time we came along, the most powerful king on the planet was the King of England. He controlled 13 million square miles, 500 million people, all of India, 1/4 of the world's population right there. America's founders decide we don't like the king thing, so we take the power of a king, separate it into 3 branches, separate it into federal to state level, tie this federal Frankenstein up with 10 handcuffs we call the first 10 amendments. And so Eisenhower said, the national government was the creature of the states, yet today Frankenstein, like the creature, wants to destroy the creators. And I'm running out of time, but who's the king in America? Well, Gouverneur Morris says the people are the king. Chief Justice John Jay said the people are the sovereign of this country. Abraham Lincoln said the people of these United States are the rightful masters of both Congresses and courts. Signer of the Constitution, James Wilson, said sovereignty resides in the people. They have not parted with it. Grover Cleveland, the sovereignty of 60 million of free people is the working out of the divine right of man to govern himself. So in America, the people are king. So when you pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic, a republic is the people are king ruling through their servants called representatives. And so when somebody steps on the flag, what they're saying is, I don't want to be the king anymore. And so imagine visiting an Old Testament king. You're going through the streets of Jerusalem and you're seeing murder, rape, and crime. And you get into the king's chamber and he has his head in his hand and he looks at you and he says, do you see all that crime coming in here? I wish somebody would fix it. You reach over, tap him on the shoulder, say, excuse me, you're the king. This is your kingdom. You're the one accountable to God to fix this mess. That's like somebody in America watching TV, seeing all the terrible stuff going on, saying, I wish somebody would come along and fix this mess. Hello, reach through the TV tube and tap you on the shoulder. You are the king. You are the one accountable to God to fix this mess. Well, I need somebody to tell me what to do. Since when does the king sit on the throne and say, can somebody tell me what I'm supposed to do here? Hello, you're supposed to tell everybody else what to do. You hear from God and you get out there and do stuff, right? James Wilson said, every citizen forms a part of the sovereign power he possesses a vote. Not to vote is to abdicate the throne. Some say, well, just trust God. You don't need to vote or get involved. Here's a great quote from Connecticut Governor Jonathan Trumbull to George Washington. He says, to trust altogether to the justice of our cause without our utmost exertion would be tempting providence. So to say, oh, just trust the Lord. You trust the Lord, but you give your utmost exertion. There's more there. I'll pick up later. And thank you so much. God bless you.